Thank you. Thanks very much. I've got to get on as well. That's okay. Thanks very much for the invite. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the confidence that I will be able to answer. I think Charles has alluded to the fact that a complex situation, and so I want to say at the beginning that there will be a chance to ask questions, and please don't feel that your question is a naive question. I probably guarantee that if you've got a question in your mind, there's somebody else in the room that's also got that question. But also, sometimes what people think is a naive question actually opens up a good discussion. So our plan is to talk, but then to allow a lot of time for us to have conversation. I need to be in Westminster for a 2 o'clock meeting, so I think we all need to be somewhere else probably for 2 o'clock anyway, so we'll be all right. So as Charles said, I am a Methodist minister, and I was superintendent here, actually in the Southwark and Deptford circuit, so not too far away at all. But since last September, I have been the Methodist liaison officer based in Jerusalem, and we have a Methodist liaison office. And it's a project that's supported by the British Methodist Church, the American Methodist Church, and the World Methodist Council. And so we have a team of 3 people in that office. We have a local office manager, and then we have an American Methodist minister and a British Methodist minister. And so currently I'm the British Methodist minister, but obviously you can tell that I'm not in Jerusalem at the moment. In fact, I left the region about a week after the horrendous Hamas attacks, and as we began to see the Israeli response to those attacks, I came back to the country, and there's been 1 or 2 other things that have happened that has kept me from returning, not least that my visa has run out, so I'm in the process of reapplying for my visa. But I have been going on Connection talking about. So it's good to be here this morning, and for those of you that were at Synod, there'll be some familiar stuff this morning, but inevitably that's the case. But I'll tell you what, let me just quickly explain what the Methodist Liaison Office does, because I know many people are not aware of the Methodist Office. We work with any Methodist pilgrims that come to the Holy Land. So I'm not a tour guide. I don't wander around with an umbrella telling you that Jesus said the following words at this point whenever. So we don't organise tours for pilgrims. But what we do say is if you've got a tour company that are putting together your pilgrimage, then ask them to add a day or 2 extra, and we will add into your experience of a pilgrimage, because very often with these tour companies you go and visit the historical sites, the historical stones of the Holy Land, but actually what we say is we'll introduce you to the living stones, and what we mean by that are the Christian communities that exist in the Holy Land. And it's really important because the number of Christians in the Holy Land is rapidly falling. And when I say Christian communities, I don't mean people that are converted. You talk about Palestinian Christian communities, and people often say, when did they convert? Because there's this assumption that all Palestinians are Muslims, but actually the Christian communities will tell you, that their ancestors were actually there on the day of Pentecost. Their families have been Christian since the church began. So they really are a line of living stones right back to Pentecost and to Jesus. So we like to do that with Methodist pilgrims. We work with different projects. We support a school, a hospital, a home for people with disabilities, a mediation centre. We support a Christian family called the Tent of Nations, and I'll refer to them later, who have land south of Bethlehem, which is under threat. We offer volunteering opportunities with those projects. We can organise it for you. So if you want to come, rather than for a 10-day, 2-week pilgrimage, but want to come and live and work and volunteer alongside, Palestinian communities will organise that for you. At the moment, there's a lot of cheap flights. So, if you want to, volunteer. We also will stand alongside any organization that is working for human rights in the region, whether that be Israeli, Palestinian, or an international organization. And then we work ecumenically. I am an associate minister of the Church of Scotland, which has St. Andrew's in Jerusalem. So I work alongside the ministry team there, and we also work with other English-speaking denominations that are there. And if we can, we will work with interfaith groups as well, although, as you can imagine, that's not always easy, but we do what we can. So that's a sort of oversight. The other thing that I'm supposed to do is what I'm doing now, which is a bit of advocacy, talking to groups, telling churches in this country what's happening, amplifying the voices. So what I want to do this morning is look at these 4 areas, and then, like I say, we'll open up to questions. I should have said, sorry, my email address is hardmand@methodistchurch.org.uk. So if you want to contact me, please do. I know some people process things differently at different speeds. It may be, I sit in meetings sometimes and people are asking all these questions, and I'm going, they're really good questions. And then about 2 days later, I suddenly realize what question I should have asked. So if you're a bit like me, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm quite happy to have a conversation via email as well. Or if you want to know anything else, then that's my email address. So we're going to look at these things, and then we're going to have the conversation. Starting with history and land. Now, people, there's always a problem when you talk about the situation in the Holy Land, when you say you're going to talk about land and history, where people say, argue about where you should start. I'm going to start with sort of round about the turn of the century in terms of moving into the 1900s. And these maps kind of illustrate what has happened in those recent times since then. So on the far left of this map, we see a yellow strip of land. I'm sure you're very familiar with the shape of this land because we have seen it many times recently on the news and in newspapers, etc. And this is sort of at the end of the 1800s, going into the 1900s. It's colored yellow on this map, which represents that the people living in that land are Palestinians. And we'll see the green, that's Jewish communities and eventually what we recognize as Israel. But at that time, and this is an important fact we need to recognize, that Palestine, as we see it there, was in fact being ruled by the Ottoman Empire. And the land has always been occupied. When we go back to biblical times, it was occupied. It's been occupied throughout its history ever since that point. And partly because it's a strategic bit of land, it's, trade routes, all that sort of stuff. But what was happening at that time was the Ottoman Empire was in decline. And in fact, the First World War was the end of the Ottoman Empire. And Palestinians were looking forward to a time when they would be able to live in their land with self-determination and self-governance. Now, put alongside that, what else is happening is that for Jewish communities, we're starting to see the growth of secular Zionism. The Zionist idea that there should be a homeland for Jewish people, there should be a land called Israel where Jews are safe, because we've got to recognize that up to that point, there have been centuries of persecution of Jews across the world, in particular in Europe. And so you've got two peoples who are looking forward to, or having a dream of, land where they can live and have that self-determination to be a state and to be a nation. So with the growth of what I'm calling secular Zionism, and I call it secular Zionism because, of course, Zionism has always been, in terms of religious Zionism, it's been there. And for many rabbis, up until the sort of end of the 1800s into the 1900s,
For many rabbis, there was a sense in which they believed God would give them the land when God decided it was the right time. What the secular Zionism movement actually did was sort of say, do you know what, we need to make sure we get this land, and we need to make sure we get this land through whatever political means or through whatever means that we can. And so there was a slight change in some strands of Judaism, and we have to remember that Judaism is not just one complete block, it has different strands within it, but within some strands of Judaism, they too began to say, well, hang on a minute, perhaps we should do more about this. So those two sort of views of Zionism came together, and there were many Zionist meetings and discussions, and then a key moment happened in 1917. And it's known as the Balfour Declaration. And Lord Balfour was the Foreign Secretary of the UK at the time, and he wrote a note to a very distinguished Jewish businessman in the UK and said, there will be a homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. Now that's a key moment, because for the Zionist movement, they latched onto that as a real promise that they would have a land. For Palestinians, they see that at the moment when they really lost that opportunity. And I always say this to people, but if you go to Palestine and you say, I'm from the UK, probably before they greet you, they'll say one word to you, and that will be Balfour. Because it's still very much for them. They feel that this was a key moment when they started to lose the chance of having their own land. Now, of course, at the end, yeah.
Why?
Why do they feel that I was?
No, why did Balfour say that?
Well, no, you're not allowed to interrupt me if you're going to ask questions like that. It's a really good question, and it's not. It wasn't an official statement of the government. It wasn't. It was him writing to somebody. The homeland has no international. There's no understanding of what homeland means internationally. So again, it wasn't termed in any kind of legal terms at all. My feeling is that that Balfour wanted to recognise that Zionism was, that Jewish people had a right to have some land, and also to say that it would be in Palestine, because some Zionists were, sort of thinking any land would do. It wouldn't have to be the Palestine, the biblical sort of land that Jews had been promised in the Promised Land narrative, but they were looking at other places. But so yeah, I'm not sure why. I haven't found a reason why he said that. Yes, so yeah, that's exactly where I was just coming on to. So at the end of the First World War, if you want to use this language, the UK, the British Army liberated Palestine, liberated Jerusalem, and then had the mandate to rule. So in some senses, we had the Ottoman Empire, and then there wasn't any freedom for the people there because the British actually had the mandate to rule. So from the end of the First World War to 1948, basically, Britain was governing the area we now call Palestine. And so there was a sense in which, and we tried very hard to produce, to produce a place where we could leave it, and there would be a homeland for Jews, and there would be land for Palestine. But in fact, what happened as we came up to 1947, which is the third map along here, was that in 1947, Britain said they were going to actually withdraw from the region, and they asked the United Nations to draw up the partition, to draw up the boundaries, the lines on the map. So just going slightly back, the second map, what we have there is we have increase in little areas of green that are Jewish communities, and they're actually buying the land. They're buying land and they're forming Jewish communities, and they're moving there because, of course, what you've got with the growth of the Nazi movement and the Second World War is this horrendous persecution of Jews, and many people were seeking sanctuary. So Jews were trying to find a safe place to be, and one place that many went was to Palestine. And of course, after the Second World War, there was a really big influx of Jewish people, and the British were trying to rule, to govern, because they had this mandate, and they were there was fighting, there was attacks, there was Jewish Palestinian, there was Palestinian Jewish, there was attacks by both Palestinians and Jews on the British, and in the end, the British kind of said in 47 that they intended to leave, and said the United Nations should draw up the partition. And that's what we get on that third map. And as you see on that third map is, and I still can't understand this, is why anybody would think that dividing a piece of land up for two nations, for two peoples, that it would be good to have one set of peoples having three complete, distinct, separate parts of the land. So what we see is up in the north, where we've got a bit of yellow. And then coming down from that, we've got the main part of yellow, which is what we call the West Bank now, because it's on the west bank of the Jordan. And then the sort of L-shaped on its side a bit towards the bottom is Gaza. So that was the United Nations that drew that up. The reason they said they did that was they said they wanted to encourage cooperation, and they felt that having, three separate areas would actually bring the two states together. I mean, hindsight is a wonderful thing, but even at a time, I'm not sure that's right. The other thing to note of that is that Israel, what became Israel, got more than 50% of the land. And so the United Nations voted it through, but the Arab states did not agree to it. Palestinians did not agree to it. The Jewish community said, yes, thank you very much, we accept that. And so what happens in 1948, in the 14th of May, the State of Israel is declared, and immediately Israel is attacked by the Arab states because they didn't agree with this, and we have a war. And what happens in that war is, and you see the next map along, the fourth map along, Israel actually win and gain land. So the bit of Palestine up in the north totally goes. Gaza is massively reduced, and the West Bank is as well. And where you see the West Bank, where it kind of goes in, is where Jerusalem is, because Jerusalem is a key issue in all of this, because both Palestine and Israel want Jerusalem to be their capital. And so 1948, 1949, you get the establishment of Israel as a state, you get them taking more land, and the Palestinians refer to that time as the Nakba, which is Arabic for catastrophe. And in fact, Palestinians will talk about it in the present tense. They haven't put it in the past because they still believe that they're experiencing something like over 700,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes, their towns, and their villages, and ended up as refugees. Some in the bordering countries, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, others in the West Bank or in Gaza, and we'll talk a bit about that later. So the penultimate map, the fifth one, is 1967. It looks no different, really, but it's an important time, 1967, because it was a 6-day war. And what happened in 1967 is that Israel actually started to occupy those Palestinian territories. So since 1967, Israel has been in the West Bank and in Gaza, being the occupying force. Now, Gaza changed slightly 17 years ago. They withdrew from Gaza, but I'll talk a little bit more about what Gaza's like then, since then anyway. But what that has meant is that Palestinians have been living under the military rule of Israel for 57 years. And I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like for local Palestinians in a bit. The final map shows more areas of green in the West Bank and a little bit in Gaza. And this is just to symbolize that what's happening in the West Bank. So the West Bank is split up into three distinct areas, A, B, and C. Area A is supposedly governed by Palestine. Area B is supposed to be a joint Palestinian-Israeli, and C is Israel. And what we actually see happening is those areas, C areas, controlled by Israel are increasing. And they are, through various ways of grabbing land, taking more and more land from the West Bank that is basically Israeli now. So places where Palestinians can't go unless they have a specific permit. And what you see is a ghettoization within the West Bank. And I do use that word knowing what connotations it has for Jewish people as well, because I think it's important for us to realize that. And you may have heard about the two-state solution, and we can talk about solutions, but actually Palestinians tell a little joke to you. They'll say, two-state solution? No, Israel's much more generous than that. They're offering us a 10-state solution. They're offering us Hebron, Bethlehem, Jenin, Nablus, etc. In other words, what they're saying is that they will have distinct places that are theirs, but all around that, apart from that, will be Israel. So that's a very quick, brief history, and there's much more to it than that, but hopefully that gives us a sense of it. And we can come back to that later as well if we want to. I want to move on to Gaza, because obviously Gaza's been very much in our news. And I love showing this photograph because I love this photograph. And I took it in Gaza in October 22 when I visited Gaza. I sent it to my family and they said to me, "You're supposed to be working." I said, "I am working." They said, "Well, where are you?" I said, "I'm in Gaza." That's not Gaza. Because even before we saw the devastation that we've seen in the last few months, we have this view of Gaza. But Gaza is on the Mediterranean. This was a beautiful, really warm, sunny October afternoon. And you know what? If it wasn't Gaza, if it wasn't occupied or barricaded, if it wasn't the scene of constant conflict, you'd be going to Gaza for holidays. I know that's a bit hard to believe, but it's true. But I want to sort of talk a little bit about Gaza before October the 7th, because obviously what happened on October the 7th was horrendous. And what we've seen since the Israeli response is horrendous. And the United Nations have just produced a report saying both Hamas and Israel have committed war crimes. But what I want to do is talk about Gaza before October the 7th, not to justify that horrendous attack on the 7th, because I can't and I wouldn't try to, but I do think it's important we understand what Gaza was like. So I said earlier that it was occupied up until about 17 years ago, and actually Israel withdrew. So they withdrew their settlements, they withdrew their population, they withdrew the army. And then what happened was that Hamas took control of Gaza, and immediately Israel blockaded Gaza. And when I say blockaded, there's three sides to Gaza that are on land. And they are surrounded with a 30-foot high concrete wall that also goes quite deep underground. The only way out of Gaza is through a small number of checkpoints, and Palestinians in Gaza, if they want to travel, they need to get a permission from Israel, and Israel notoriously does not give people the permission to leave Gaza. When I was leaving Gaza in October 22, I was waiting to get through. It took us 3 hours to get through security. And there were grandparents with very ill children. And these children were leaving Gaza to get some medical help. And I asked somebody, I said, why is it always grandparents that are taking them? And the answer is that Israel won't give permits to their parents because they think that they won't come back. They'll get out for the medical treatment and then stay outside of Gaza. So they give them to the grandparents because they believe the grandparents will bring the children back because the parents don't want to be without. So the amount of control and the life on the Palestinians is immense. But here's, I'll just say the sea as well. Obviously you've got the sea, but the sea is controlled as well. I think because I think there's lots of reasons. I think one reason is that, you know, Hamas is not in control of the West Bank. So I think there is a worry that there might be, you know, some Hamas, maybe some military wing of Hamas that would get out of Gaza and maybe, you know, start trouble in the West Bank, although there is trouble in the West Bank anyway. They don't need Hamas there anyway. I think it's about, you know, ensuring that there is a tight control on where Palestinians are and what they do. It's not quite the same in the West Bank, but people cannot travel freely from the West Bank into Israel. So you have to have permits, you have to have you know, agreements. So, you know, if you live in Bethlehem and work in Jerusalem or get a job in Jerusalem as a Palestinian, you have to get a permit from Israel to travel from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. It's only 4 or 5 miles. Half of Jerusalem is supposedly Palestinian controlled, East Jerusalem, but you still have to get the permit to travel. And so there is control over the movement of Palestinians. Many Palestinians, you know, to fly to Israel, you fly to Tel Aviv. If you want to go to Palestine, you fly to Tel Aviv and then you travel. But actually, there's quite a few Palestinians. Many Palestinians are not allowed to fly out of Tel Aviv. So because it's just their movement is constantly controlled. The number of permits and permissions is just mind-boggling, you know, and it depends on lots of different things. And then even in the West Bank, if you have a permit and the checkpoint's closed because Israel decided to close the checkpoint, you can't travel. October the 7th, on the afternoon of October the 7th, the whole of the West Bank was shut down. So I was living in the West Bank. I was living in the Bethlehem municipality, and I could not drive to Jerusalem, again, a few miles away, because not only were the checkpoints closed, but at the end of my road, there were concrete blocks placed there to stop any movement at all out the West Bank. So there is a constant restriction of movement, and Israel exercised that, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank all the time. So Gaza, these are easy figures, because I like easy figures because I'm not a mathematician. But if we imagine Gaza as 100 people, we know it's 2.2 million people. We might not realize that it's the size of the Isle of Wight. It's a very small piece of land. But of those 100 people, 47 are children. So a very young population. Of those 47 children, 45 suffer from trauma, depression, and anxiety. And I'll show you another graphic a bit later as to part of the reason for that. But basically, what we're seeing at the moment is horrendous, and the amount of destruction and death and the length of time is far more than we've seen recently. But we have seen regular conflict in Gaza, and so these children are living with that, and that produces this trauma and anxiety. 37 actually say that their biggest fear is the sound of aircraft. And you don't fly over the airspace of Palestine. Nobody flies over it. It's a no-fly zone, apart from the Israeli Defence Forces. I've spent most of my life living in and around Manchester, and often by Manchester Airport, and I've been under flight paths. When I started living in the West Bank, it was like there's no planes in the sky. It was like when the volcano happened. Remember that, when we had no planes flying? But when you hear a plane, you know it's a war plane. And so for children in Gaza, when they hear a plane, they associate it with bombing and with all that goes with that. So the opposite then, if 47 are children, 53 are adults, and again, 38 of these adults have depression. When you think about that, you are seeing a community, a population who are suffering from immense mental health issues. And you add to that actually Gaza is densely populated. You're very aware. My first night when I was there, after getting through all the security, and after, and I was, as that photo, as that photo indicates, I was on the coast where I was staying, but actually, before I went to sleep that night, I asked myself the question: what if there was an attack tonight? Where would I go? Because it's so densely populated, it just felt like you would be trapped in, and I experienced that for a few nights when I was staying there. People have had their lives like that for sort of 17, 18 years. So 70% of the people that live in Gaza are internally displaced, or families of internally displaced people. So I mentioned before that in 1948, the Nakba of 700,000 Palestinians were driven out of their homes, and many of them went to Gaza. And so there are refugee camps in Gaza, families who still live there. They're not tents or anything that we might imagine refugee camps to be like. They've been built up, and they are, but literally, some of the roads, or the alleyways, I suppose they're not roads, but they're quite literally that wide. They're so densely packed in to the country. And 82 people live in poverty. It's an incredibly poverty-stricken part of the world. 95 do not have direct access to clean water, and 63 are food insecure. This is, and I reiterate, all before October the 7th. I used to work for Christian Aid. If I was here talking to you as a Christian Aid, a member of staff, telling you about a place where 63% of people are food insecure, 95% of people don't have access to clean water, all those figures, we would be saying, this is dreadful, this level of poverty, we need to do something about it. This is a graphic I mentioned earlier. So this is a 16-year-old child. And you see at various points in their lives, at age 2 and 5 and 7 and 11 and 14 and 15 and 16, we see the conflict that is happening in Gaza. And there's on the right of this, there's a quote here that says, in Gaza there is no post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic because the trauma is repetitive and ongoing and continuous. So it's not about trauma or secondary trauma, actually there's continuous because of this. So I mentioned earlier about Christian communities, and I just want to share a little bit about Christians who live in the Holy Land, Christians that live in Palestine. And I want to share with you a quote here: "As humans, we have no hope." This is actually from a Lutheran Palestinian pastor who says, "As humans, we have no hope." This image here that you see is in Bethlehem. I mentioned the wall that surrounds Gaza. It's exactly the same as the wall that snakes for 450 miles across the West Bank. And this bit of the wall actually comes into Bethlehem. Bethlehem should be governed by Palestine, but the wall has been brought in right into Bethlehem, and it goes right around Rachel's tomb to protect Israeli settlers who have made their home in that part. And you can see you can see the watchtower. There are watchtowers across that wall. When the only way to get to the other side of the wall is through checkpoints. And as I've said already, checkpoints, as long as you've got the permits, you can get through. But actually, if Israel decide to close them, and they do, then they are just closed. Also, you're at the whim of the IDF, who will be sort of checking your permit or checking your car or checking your passport or whatever. whether or not they let you through. So for Palestinians, they live with this brutal wall, and it has grabbed land. It was built as a response to particularly the Second Intifada, which was sort of, as we came into the 2000s, there was a lot of suicide bombing, and so Israel decided that it needed to protect its population, so they built this wall. I don't believe that a wall is the best way to protect your population. I don't believe that conflict's the best way to protect your population. But if you're going to build a wall, then, you know, at least build it along agreed borders or some sort of agreed borders. But this doesn't go along those borders that I showed you, either for 1948 or 67 or any of those. It snakes right in across. And that's how some of that land has turned green in that last piece of land that I showed you. This again is Bethlehem, and this is one of the projects we support. The Mediation Centre is just by this particular part of the wall, and when I was there one time and I was asked to say grace because we were having a barbecue, the gate you see opened and IDF soldiers came out. They started then firing rubber bullets and tear gas at a group of young Palestinians who were throwing stones at the wall. I've said grace 1,000 times, but to say grace against the sound of rubber bullets, tear gas, to give thanks for God's goodness was very, very difficult indeed, and made worse because the tear gas was just coming across where we were, and we were all affected by it. Refugees, I've mentioned this image of the quay here is over the arch to an entrance to a refugee camp. In 1948, the United Nations passed a resolution that said that Palestinians had the right to return, as long as they respected their neighbours, they had the right to return to their homes and to their villages and their towns. And the key has become a real symbol for that. So the families hand down the keys from generation to generation. And the heads of the families now hold on to these keys in the belief that one day they will be able to return. I mean, their homes and their towns are vastly different now because it's, you know, it's been over 70 years. But they hold on to that right of return. And that right of return has very often been pushed back when there's been peace processes. It's been left to the end, and they've never got to the end. So it's never, a lot of Palestinians feel that it's never been taken seriously. This is from Hebron. Hebron is always a bit of a flashpoint. And, you know, I'm advised not to go to Hebron on my own. I'm advised to go with a tour guide. In Hebron, you see this, but you see this across the West Bank. So you've got IDF soldiers here who are talking to this young Palestinian. I don't know what happened to this young Palestinian because we just got out of Hebron. We quite literally did. We made a phone call to the minibus that picked us up and we got out, because very often this sort of thing can be a flashpoint and result in violence. But Israel have what they call administrative detention. So they can arrest without charge anybody that they want and detain them. Since October the 7th, something like over 8,000 Palestinians have been arrested under administrative detention, and they are kept without contact with their families. Very often it's possibly only lawyers that will see them, but that's sketchy as well. So it is, you know, really, really hard for Palestinians, and you do see it regularly. You see, especially young men being arrested, and some much younger than this. I've witnessed, you know, 9-10-year-olds being detained by the IDF. I've mentioned settlements. On the left here, the slide, it's not the brightest color in the world, but here you see a building of settlements, and this is illegal under international humanitarian law. So if you occupy a land, you are not allowed to build in that land. If you occupy a land, you're not allowed to move your population into that land. But yet Israel has systematically built settlements, and they are strategic. This one's on a hill, many of them are on a hill, and they are being linked by roads that Palestinians aren't allowed to travel on. So all of this just grabs land and takes land. It also disconnects families from one another. It sometimes disconnects land. So farmers, Palestinian farmers, don't traditionally live on their land. As we imagine in this country, you have a farmhouse and the land surrounds it. So for instance, you know, I know farmers that live in Bethlehem that will have land to the south or wherever. And so when you start getting these roads going across and settlements, it gets harder and harder even to get to your land. And if you leave your land without being farmed, then Israel will they will take it as their land. So, but also these settlements take up the vast majority of water. And so the amount of water per Israeli living in a settlement compared to per Palestinian living in their towns or villages is totally unequal. And so the resources, and quite often what you see is, this was just being built, as you can tell by the cranes, but very often when they're built, you'll see that they're green and they're grassy and they look, you know, fertile, whereas, you know, Palestinian villages look quite the opposite. The more colourful picture is taken in Hebron, and this actually is part of a street where Israeli settlers are living above Palestinians. And the wire fencing that's above your head is there because you can see rubbish was being thrown down. This was taken 20 odd years ago, this photograph. If you took the photograph today, you wouldn't see through because there's tarpaulin and everything, because actually the type of rubbish that was being thrown down, the type of human rubbish that was being thrown down quite easily goes through that wire fence. Just a little bit about now. We've seen a lot about now, and I just wanted to highlight some things. Human Rights Watch produced this report in April or May now, saying that Israel had dropped more bombs on the Gaza Strip since October than were dropped in Dresden and London and Hamburg in the Second World War. A massive amount of munitions dropped on this area. And then just a quote here. You may remember very recently, last weekend in fact, 4 hostages were released. And of course, you know, it's great that they were rescued. It's great that they were safe and that they were well and that they're reunited with their families. But to achieve that, well over 250 Palestinians were killed and hundreds were injured. And this is a journalist who just, you know, asks these questions. Are we mere numbers? Is our blood so easily disregarded? Our suffering overlooked? The lives of Israeli captives deemed more valuable than ours? Why doesn't the world see us? Why doesn't the world feel? And that why doesn't the world see us and why doesn't the world hear is quite a common phrase that you hear from Palestinians, and I hear it from Palestinian Christians, and they say to me, why does the UK church ignore us? And they see the UK, admittedly not necessarily the church, but they see the UK government taking a pro-Israeli side, saying that they won't call for a ceasefire, that Israel has the right to self-defense, that, you know, all the rest of it, continuing to sell arms to Israel, and they ask the question, why do you not hear us? And the Palestinian pastor, I've heard him say exactly the same, and he said it directly to me, he said it to the churches here. But then he finishes his quote, and he says, as humans we have no hope, but as Christians we live hope. And, you know, I want to just look at what that hope might actually mean. And so I want to just share with you 3 voices of peace, and then we'll stop and we can have questions and we can have a conversation. The first one I mentioned that we support a Christian family, and they have land south of Bethlehem. It's surrounded by 5 settlements, and since 1990 they have been fighting Israel to keep their land. They have the legal deeds. Their family bought it. They produced those deeds in court and everything, but still they are fighting to keep their land. Just recently, a caravan appeared right up on their fence, and it's a caravan of a settler. And once somebody starts living in that caravan, then Israel will declare a security zone about it, which means that they will lose a significant part of their land just at that point. And what will happen with this settlement is that more people will come and live there, so the security will get bigger and bigger. And their crops have been destroyed, their livestock have been attacked, they themselves have been attacked. And a couple of years, maybe 18 months ago, one of the brothers ended up in hospital quite seriously injured from an attack. But this is what they say. Based on our Christian values, we are a people who believe in justice. We have to find another way. We have to challenge hatred with love, darkness with light, evil with good. We refuse to be enemies. One of the saddest things about the October the 7th attacks was that many people that bore the brunt of that evil day and the Hamas attacks was the people who were peace activists, because a lot of Israelis that lived around Gaza in those kibbutz were actually active in trying to find some sort of peaceful solution. And one such peace activist who was killed that day, at his funeral, his sister gave the eulogy, and she shared these words, directing them to the Israeli government. Do not use our deaths and our pain to cause the death and pain of other people or other families. I demand that we stop the circle of pain and understand that the only way forward is freedom and equal rights, peace, brotherhood, and security for all human beings. And then another voice, and a refugee, he lives in a refugee camp in Bethlehem. And last summer, probably about a year ago now actually, the IDF raided in the middle of the morning, as in middle of early morning, middle of night, sort of 2-3 in the morning, raided the refugee camp, which is quite a common occurrence. But on this particular day, they broke down his front door and entered his house. And he wasn't arrested, and nobody has been arrested since. So I do not understand what this was about. But he lives there with his wife and his 3 young boys, all under the age of 10. And when I was talking to him about the experience, he said to me, I must stop my children growing up to hate Israelis. But when they come into my house in the middle of the night and wake my children up and stand over them with their guns, my children are scared and I am scared that this fear will grow into hate as they grow. I'm going to stop there. I've talked quite a lot and we've had some questions, but let's open it up for some more. Okay, we got one straight away from Charles.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you for coming to speak to us about, as I introduced, it is a very concerning problem. Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. What do you think of these 2 sides, with all these people being in both sides? What are these people of faith saying? That's question number 1. Number 2, I have 4, but I will ask you first 2.
Okay.
Yeah. Number 2, why is that all those people who are running from the Palestinian side are not accepted by the countries around? Do you understand my question? You don't understand my question.
I think I do, but I don't want to answer it if I'm not 100% sure. No,
Those are my two questions.
just explain that last one a little bit more. I don't want to start answering something if I've got the wrong end of the stick.
I have the same point, namely that Egypt has a border with Gaza,
Yeah.
and Egypt is quite clearly refusing to allow anybody to leave through that border into Egypt.
Yeah.
Even though Egypt is pretty empty of that.
Yeah. Okay. So that's fine. That's kind of what I thought you meant. So your first question is about faiths that are there, and then we'll look at that question. Yeah. Obviously, it is an incredibly important part of land for all those faiths that you mentioned, for Judaism, for Islam, and for Christianity. And there are many people within those three faith traditions who are working for peace, who are working for a situation where those three faiths can live side by side and promote peace. We don't hear about them very often, but an example is Rabbis for Human Rights, who it does what it says on the tin, really. They are rabbis and they work for human rights. But in October, during the harvest, olive tree harvest, they will actually go and pick olives alongside Palestinians. And the reason they do that is because very often the olive trees are targeted by settlers, the harvest is targeted by settlers, and they go and stand alongside Palestinians, proclaiming that they understand what their faith means. And their faith means that you live in peace with one another, and you don't oppress, and you don't show your dominance by violence. It's just one example, but there are plenty of people that do live there and are seeking to bring peace because of their faith that drives them to do that. Obviously, there is a faith element within certain people's Zionism and the Promised Land narrative that for some Jews, they will say, look, this is the land that God has given to us, therefore it's ours, it should be no one else's. And again, there is different interpretations of that, because I've talked to many rabbis who say to me, yeah, there is a promise, but it's a covenant. And actually, God demands something of us, and God makes it very clear. When our prophets walked in this land, God made it very clear through their voice what's expected of us. And so, I have talked to rabbis who say, of course I want Israel, I want a homeland, I want somewhere where I can be an Israeli and I can be Jewish, but also I know that God actually doesn't want us to be oppressing or violently oppressing people. So there are those religious voices within that. I think in terms of the Egypt question, in terms of why the borders haven't been opened so that Palestinians have somewhere to go, I think Egypt are in an incredibly difficult situation. If they'd have opened their border, and if they'd let 2 million Palestinians out, then Gaza is no longer Palestinian. Egypt have an uneasy peace with Israel. They do have a peace treaty with them, but we could have looked at some of those maps and gone back to a time when Israel actually occupied part of Egypt. And so I think it seemed incredibly inhumane for Egypt to say, we're not opening our border, we're not letting anybody through. But on the other hand, many Palestinians and people in Gaza actually believe that if Palestinians left Gaza, for them it would be the end. It's the end of any chance of Palestine. I know there's still the West Bank, but that is very much the feeling of Palestinians, that the Nakba would be completed if they were forced out of Gaza into Egypt, because they would just become refugees in Egypt with nobody living in Palestine. So, I think the same for the other countries around is that they haven't wanted necessarily to facilitate, because some of Israel want actually to drive out the Palestinians totally, and they've not wanted to facilitate that. Yeah, and then we'll come to you. So first one here, and then you. Yeah.
I suppose most of us would agree that a nation is entitled to defend itself. I suppose none of us would have quarrelled much if the Israelis had gone in to try and rescue the hostages that have been taken. But when you put a slide up there that shows the amount of conditions that have been dropped on Gaza, somebody's paying for that, someone's providing it. I wonder to what degree the West is frightened of upsetting the Jewish people, never mind Israel. Or sort of stylise Jews as being healthy or influential people, but I wonder to what degree that is part of the problem, that the West is frightened to upset the Jews. Yeah. And the other thing that occurs is what's left? Right. I mean, you say they don't want the Jordanians to leave Gaza, but what's there for anybody to live in now?
Yeah, yeah. Was it similar to the question? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Can I just add?
Yeah.
I think there is a problem between the secular Israel and the Jewish faith. And a lot of people are worried that if they criticize Israel, they're going to be accused of being anti-Jewish.
Yeah.
It's a very fine line. And I think this is probably why the Israelis feel they can act with impunity, because they're being supported by the West, because the West don't want to be seen as anti-Semitic.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, let's talk about anti-Semitism before, and then we'll come back to sort of within that sort of supporting Israel. I think you're absolutely right. People are very frightened and very scared of criticizing Israel because they will be accused of being anti-Semitic. And I think the truth is that actually Israel weaponized anti-Semitism. And so people are accused of being anti-Semitic. So the United Nations are accused of being anti-Semitic because they say Israel's committed war crimes. Actually, if they've committed war crimes, and I actually think there is a very strong evidence that they have, that's not anti-Semitic. It's actually just challenging their behavior. And because actually war crimes and the whole international law were set up to try and ensure that in conflict, civilians are protected. So it has been weaponized, and it is weaponized. And on one side of that, I think there's a danger that we actually miss what is truly anti-Semitic, because anti-Semitism is horrendous. You know, that way in which people will judge, people will act, and people will oppress Jewish people, we need to make sure that we wipe that out, and we need to be very clear what it is. I was in a meeting where the Board of Deputies, which is an organisation in this country of Jewish people, and they speak a lot on behalf of Jewish people in this country. And the director was asked, you know, about this question, anti-Semitism, and his response was this. He said, "You can say to me that you think Netanyahu is wrong about what he's doing in Gaza." He said, "I disagree with you, but you can say it." He said, "You can say that too many civilians have died, and you're not being anti-Semitic. You're making a judgment and a criticism, and I would argue against it, but it's not anti-Semitic. If you said to me, well, Netanyahu is a baby killer," then he said, "that's being anti-Semitic, because the sort of old tropes around Jewish people." And I think that's I didn't agree with a lot that he said in that talk that I went to, but I actually thought that was really useful and really helpful. We have to be very clear about what we're doing. To criticize Israeli policy is not anti-Semitic, and we shouldn't be stopped criticizing because we think we're going to be anti-Semitic. We need to be brave and say that, yeah? But we do need to watch the language that we use about it and to make sure that we don't sort of get back into those tropes. And as much as you sort of very carefully said You know, we don't want to imply Jews are wealthy and powerful and influential, because that's, again, is another anti-Semitic trope that there is. So, you know, thank you for your carefulness around that. And you know, we have to do that. But I do believe that we need to do it. But I also believe that part of the reason why, you know, it's being weaponized by Israel to try and stop criticism of what they're doing. I think, you know, the first part of the question about the supply, the support, etc. You know, I'm not a great expert on American politics, but of course we know that America is a very keen supporter of Israel. United Nations, Israel, America uses its veto numerous times for anything that's critical of Israel. And we know, and just recently there has been another package of military aid agreed. What I don't understand is, because America also have a statute that says that they will not provide arms to anybody that is committing war crimes. And yet Biden at one point did refuse to supply some arms, but that's a real drop in the ocean compared to it. In our country, we have regulations about who we allow people to sell arms to. The government controls that, and we still say it's okay to supply arms to Israel. And you know, the US and the UK have been particularly sort of strident in supporting Israel. When the warrants were issued by the International Criminal Court for both leaders of Hamas and the Israeli government, you know, we kind of said, no, that's not right, that shouldn't happen. America said the same thing. So what's it about? Why is it? And you know, I haven't got an absolute answer for this. I think there is on the one hand, there is that sense in which there's maybe still a bit of a leftover guilt about the Holocaust and what happened. And therefore we need to, you know, we need to be seen to be protecting Israel's interests. I also think that we protect Israel because it's the border between us and the Arab world. And we kind of see Israel as a more Western country than the Arab countries. So I think there's some global politics in that as well. I do have to say, and this gets to your point as well, there is a very strong lobby, a strong lobby. You know, and that is seen across society. So for instance, the Methodist Church, we get lobbied on what we say about the situation. We get lobbied by Jewish communities and by Israel about the answers to memorials that go to conference. And so there is a, you know, and we try and maintain a good relationship with Jewish community because we believe in interfaith work, as we do with Islamic communities as well. But this is a constant sort of pressure that we do feel. So there is that pressure, but I also think there is some global sort of politics as well, sort of around all of this. But you're right, you know, Israel keeps being armed and keeps being able to, you know, to drop that number of bombs on Gaza. Your question is what's left as well, I think you also said. And that is a really good question. I mean, I think the last figures I saw, something like 70% of you know, buildings are either destroyed or damaged, and you know, what's going to happen, and this has been a constant thing, you know, Biden's always said, what's the day after, what's the day after? You know, is there going to be any sort of support to rebuild Gaza? And I think that really depends on what Israel's true intent is for Gaza. Did they intend to drive Palestinians out of Gaza? You know, or what were they trying to do? And you know, will the international community help to rebuild? And you know, because it's going to take a heck of a lot. And it's not just buildings, it's not just residential buildings or commercial buildings. I've got another picture taken a similar time of that one I showed you with the waves and everything, of a mosque. And it's again a beautiful picture. And a few weeks ago, I was reading an article that was talking about the cultural buildings that have been destroyed, and their main picture was that mosque just totally destroyed. So we've got, you know, it's a total infrastructure. So it is a question, and I don't know what the answer is, but I do think it depends on the will of, you know, what's it going to look like? Would Israel be happy with Palestinians still being in Gaza or not? Because if they are, then people can start to rebuild. But if they're not,
I think the history lesson you showed indicated they don't.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this government, way before October the 7th, you know, Netanyahu has been very clear that he believes that the whole of that land should be Israel's, and he's not the only one. And certainly him, you know, actually having the right wing in his government, because he needed them to form a government, you know, they are the people that say there's no such thing as Palestinians. They don't even recognize Palestinians. So they are the ones that want to drive out. And for me, I worry about what's going to happen in the West Bank. You know, is the West Bank next? I don't know. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. 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 I'll repeat it. Yeah. Okay. So the question, because I realize you probably couldn't hear it, the question is, so the war finishes, Netanyahu goes, and there's a leader who is willing to negotiate a two-state solution. Would they withdraw and from the land that they already occupy within? I've paraphrased that right, haven't I? Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So the first thing to say is, once the war is over, Netanyahu will go. There's no question about that. Netanyahu is not a popular leader, and he's facing fraud charges, and everyone says he will go once the war finishes, and so he will be out, and there will be an election. There'll be a new government. Now, what that government will look like, we don't know. But if the scenario is if it's a two-state solution. So obviously the idea of a two-state solution is exactly what it says, that there's Palestine, that they're Israel, that they're recognized as states, and that they live in the West Bank and Gaza, assuming that they're allowed to stay in Gaza. So there are hundreds of thousands of Israelis that have moved into the West Bank. And I've heard Palestinians say to me, how can we drive them out of the West Bank? If we're going to have a two-state solution, how can we drive them out? Because they remember, or they've been told the stories from their families about the Nakba when they were driven out of their land. So there is that. Having said that, when Israel withdrew from Gaza, they did withdraw from the settlements. They did take their population out, but we're not talking about hundreds of thousands that were in Gaza. So I personally, my own personal feeling is, I think the two-state solution is probably dead in the water. And that's from listening to certainly Palestinians talk about it. And I think what's happened with October the 7th is that those Israelis that are perhaps a bit more sort of saying, yeah, okay, it's fine, we can live alongside each other, have kind of said, well, no, we can't. And I think that there is that fear that even with a two-state solution with defined borders, that there would still be fighting and stuff. What the solution is, I don't know, but I have heard people talk about a one-state solution. And I don't think this is as easy as perhaps it sounds, but The idea that there is one land, and so you have the two sides having to give up something. So if there's one land, Palestinians would probably have to give up the fact that they have, you know, that dream of self-determination and having their own state. Yeah. And Israel would have to give up the fact that they would have their own Jewish homeland, because you would have to have a pluralistic country. And I've heard Palestinians say, call it Israel if you like, I don't mind that, but make sure I've got the same human rights as any Israeli or Jewish person within that land. So in some ways, that's still a very difficult place to get to, but I wonder whether that might be the easier thing than trying to extract so many settlers. But you still don't get past, you know, what happens to, you know, the Nasser family in the Tent of Nations when they lose all that land. I hope they don't, but it's looking likely they'll lose land. You know, actually, you need to have in some sort of solution, they need to get their land back in some way as well. So it's an incredibly difficult solution. I'll come back across here, and then I'll just let one come back, and then I'll come to you. Okay, just hang. Yeah.
UAE seems quite interested. If they were to join, would that potentially aid the two states if UAE were on that side?
So the question is whether if UAE were join.
You know, the money that the Syrians were Russian.
Right. Yeah.
At the moment, that's happening.
Yeah.
And they're trying to obviously hurt the Americans. So if they were on that side, might that not help?
To be honest, I don't know. I'd need to do much more reading about that, and I will go away and do that. So thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry.
Every time
I'll come to you.
I see a crying Palestinian child, I can see another recruit for Hamas.
Right.
And the more they bomb, the more they're not bringing peace, are they? They're not even trying to overcome them, but they're actually building opposition.
When sort of the Israeli government responded to October the 7th and said, we will do two things, we will destroy Hamas and we'll get the hostages back. My personal feeling then, and it's not been disproved, was you can't do both those things. Actually, I think you're right. I think there is a real danger that the more death and destruction that occurs is for those that are left. And I think part of the reason as well is that actually for quite a few years now, we've not seen any sort of political will to try and find some sort of peace process. You know, suddenly October the 7th happened and suddenly international governments were saying, oh, two-state solution, let's, you know, but actually for the most part, we'd ignored Israel-Palestine. We knew it wasn't the best place, but there was a sense of containment within it. And so what I was seeing in the West Bank, because I know the West Bank far better than Gaza, but I was seeing in the West Bank was a generation of young Palestinians who are growing up under oppression, under occupation, who have seen no political will to do something different. And actually they've lost hope, and they will turn to hate and to weapons. And we were seeing in the West Bank before October the 7th, 2 or 3 years of an increase in violence, and groups of young Palestinians forming themselves, not following Hamas or not following anyone else, just forming little groups and trying to sort of hurt Israel by attacking settlers or attacking IDF. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right, and it goes deeper than just the moment of Hamas. And I think that's why, for me, it's so important that, one, the international community call for a ceasefire, but then also call for and insist on a process to try and find some sort of justice and peace, because we are in danger, very big danger, of just prolonging. I mean, it's gone on long enough as it is. These are ridiculous figures. Israel's been around for 76 years. For 57 years, the West Bank and Gaza have been occupied. These are figures years that we should say is far too long anyway. But I think we have to find some sort of process to enable that to stop. So, I do agree with you. Sorry, thanks for your patience.
I just wanted to ask, as a matter of fact, really, Israel in many respects claims to be a democracy, a modern state. It has citizenship. Citizenship, the fundamental aspect of citizenship is that it's equal. I understand that they have Palestinian citizens. So can you disentangle? You've been talking about the Palestinians, but you've not been talking about citizens of Israel, or also Palestinians. You've been talking about citizens, people who are not citizens. So tell me a bit about the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, and are they a completely crushed minority, or do they actually have some clout?
So yes, so there are what are known as Arab Israelis, and of course the history of it is sort of where people were living at the time when Israel was formed, etc., etc. And so there are these Arab Israelis that live in what we recognize as Israel now, not Palestine. Israel will say that they have equal rights. If you talk to them, they will say we don't have equal rights, and that they will argue that.
Do they fight in the army?
I think yes, but then when they talk about not having those sort of same equal rights is around the more subtle things. The oppression of the West Bank is very obvious. Your checkpoint, land grab, all that. Home demolitions, all of that. But for them, it's things like job opportunities, or those sort of subtle discrimination that we would talk about in terms of racism in this country, etc. So that would be but Israel would say no, they have equal rights, and they can vote, and there are predominantly Arab-based political parties, but they never gain any sort of power or any sort of influence within Israel itself. Richard,
Can I just ask you a little bit about the Christian community? What's left of it, particularly in the Palestinian territories? I understand that they've got a rich and long history, and that there are many denominations present there. But as you know, I lived in Italy for a number of years, and met many Palestinian Christians who fled from the Holy Lands, and they told me that what's left is really just a rump of what was there before. But what's left, and what's the future for the Christian community?
The numbers are a bit difficult to tell, because actually quite a few people have left since October the 7th. And part of the reason for that is Palestinian Christians living within the West Bank very often were more affluent than other Palestinians, and have the ability to travel. They have the resources to get out. They're able to get elsewhere. And I was talking to an Episcopal pastor, who said, I've got two families who are getting ready to leave now this coming week. And so we are talking about low thousands of Christians. Where I was living in the West Bank, Bet Jala used to be a Christian town, and what that meant was the majority of people that lived there were Christian. Now it's not, it's predominantly Muslim. There's still a lot of Christians concentrated there because of history. So the real worry is that actually we're going to get to the point where we don't have any of those families left. And the only things that we'll have left Christian-wise in that country are churches, and maybe a few clergy that are caretakers who greet people that come on pilgrimage. But no Christian community to be living there, to be a presence, to be part of the political system, to be part of any possible solution for the future. So it's a real worry for the Christian community. It is getting harder for the Christian community. I mean, okay, so it's hard for Palestinians, yeah, but also for the Christian community. So, you know, when I was there in September, October, there were reports in the news about clergy being spat on by Israeli settlers. There's news about some of the land that these churches are on being taken by Israel to be theirs. And after October the 7th in the Armenian quarter, settlers just kind of moved in to try and take some of that quarter as well. So it's not only the occupation for individual Palestinians that and Christians think we're going to leave for the future of our children, it's also becoming a little bit harder, which I don't understand why Israel don't challenge it more, because actually, you know, obviously Christian tourism to the region is a massive income. So it is more and more difficult, and I think the fear that you hear from Christian leaders is that very soon we're going to see an end to any viable Christian community. Yeah. Sure.
My two questions?
Yeah.
Thank you, David. When two people are fighting for this particular land where you stand, everybody is claiming, I mean, each one is saying, this is mine, the other one says, it is mine. But that particular land should belong to somebody originally. Do you agree with me?
Well,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Now, the bottom line is, I mean, as we sit here, everybody is hurting to see somebody being killed. And we as ministers, we encourage people, we encourage the congregations to try and help in the name of Jesus Christ. Of course, we have the Gaza appeal, which is saying Christians have to try and help. That will be part of my second question. Do you think there is a true history that says this land doesn't belong to this one, it belongs to that one? Because the reason, the bottom line is, they are fighting for the land. Isn't that land really for Palestinians? Isn't that land really for Jews? That's the question. Is there any history that can establish to try and finish this conflict? That's number one question. The second question is, which is the fourth one, is how do you share the contribution Christians are bringing? How do those help go to either to Jews or to Palestinians? I think you have understood my two questions. How do you do that?
Okay, I think so. Question of land, of course, is, I mean, in this conflict, but in many different conflicts, is the key question. So if I was to ask a question and to say, whose is this land? what would we say? Sorry? Well, this is the churches, okay? But let's talk more generally. The UK, whose land is that? Sorry? The Welsh. So, come on, the Welsh, because they were here first. Yeah? I mean, I asked that question because it's an incredibly different. We think of it as the UK. I mean, you know, maybe the Welsh, the Scottish think differently in terms of certain areas, whatever. But actually, the truth is that we can see that we too have been occupied. Yeah? We too have had people coming from across the seas, and you know, we too. And what is our history? Who are we? Who are the British that we now call this the land? Yeah, and so I think what I'm trying to say is that I think land is it's hard to say whose land actually really is, because I think if you look at anybody's country, you will see this history of people taking it over and wars and everything else. With the Holy Land, you know, we add into that the fact that we have the Bible that tells us in the Hebrew tradition that God promised this land to Israel. And we as Christians have kind of, you know, we have the Hebrew scriptures as part of our Bible, and we share those stories and we share that narrative. And so I think that adds a complication to it. Yeah. Sorry?
I think that's the side we are at as West as Christians.
Yeah.
We are outside.
But I would argue that we need to do a lot of work with the Promised Land narrative. Okay, I would argue that as Christians, you know, I was brought up, you know, I'm a good Methodist. Well, I was brought up a Methodist. Whether I'm a good one's another matter. But you know, I was in Sunday school. I went through Methodist Sunday school, and I was told the stories of Abraham, of Moses, of Joshua. I was told those stories. I didn't question them. I did not question them at all. They were part of the history of Christianity. I was taught them as a kid, but actually, when I go back to them now, I have to ask a question. You know, is it right that God says, and you know, that Joshua can go and surround Jericho and then go and kill every man, woman, child, and animal that's in Jericho, so that Joshua's people can own that land? I'm sorry, that's not the God who is revealed to me in Jesus Christ. So I want to ask that question. There's also the question, of course, Abraham, you know, where we're told that the land will be given to Abraham's descendants. Well, who are the descendants of Abraham? You know, you read it through the Hebrew scripture, and it's Isaac and it is the Jewish people. But Ishmael is also a descendant of Abraham, and Ishmael is considered to be the father of Arabs. So, you know, I think we have to work out what this Promised Land narrative is. And I think the other thing we need to do as well is we have been guilty of reading the Promised Land narrative as, and I'm talking now from the sort of the British colonial way of seeing things. Because let's face it, the British country decided that we could go across the world and we could go into any land we wanted, and we could strip it of its resources, and we could benefit from it. So, you know, I think those are challenges for us, and I'm starting that journey myself, because, like I say, I was brought up as you know, good Christian Methodist who read those stories and didn't question them. So I think lands really is a tricky issue, which is why for me, when rabbis say to me, yes, we're promised this by God, but actually we are also, the covenant from us is how do we live, you know, and the Old Testament tells us that, you know, we respect the people that are in our land, that we treat, you know, that the prophets have told us what God wants from us, and we need to live like that. So I'm not going to say whose land it is, you know, and also I would, yeah, okay, thinking on my feet now, I would also say that the God that I understand, if we can ever understand God, but, actually, God wants a land where all people, all of God's creation can actually live, If we believe that the whole of humanity, however we interpret the creation story, but if we believe that the whole of humanity is God's creation, the world is God's creation, then surely, whether we are Arab or Jew or Western or Christian, whether we're black, we're white, whatever we are, God wants us all to live as human beings together. So, I think that a land where, a nation lives and doesn't treat someone else equally is not part of God's plan. I've forgotten the second part of your question now, Charles. What was your second one? Sorry? Where's the money going?
Is the money about whether it goes to Israel?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, we launched the Gaza Appeal. We launched the Gaza Appeal because we wanted to do something to help. Well, yeah. Well, but that doesn't mean it's the only thing that we do, okay? I think that, what we've seen is with over 37,000 Palestinians killed, conservative estimates reckon there's at least another 10,000 people buried under the rubble, with the number of injuries and etc., and you saw the poverty figures that I showed you about Gaza. Actually, to try and get some money to Gaza to support those people, we felt was actually important. I said earlier that as a Methodist liaison office, we will work interfaith, we will work with people that are standing for human rights. So, what we do in the country is we don't just work with Palestinian communities, we do work with, Israeli organizations, we do work with others. So it's not exclusively Palestinian, but I would argue that the injustice that we see has been meted out on the Palestinians. I'm not saying that Israelis don't suffer, don't get me wrong, Israelis do suffer. And I've seen and I've spoken to, and I get their sense of fear, I get their sense of worry. I understand that October the 7th was massive for them in terms of their understanding of who they were. It really shocked them. They thought that they were safe and secure, and to have that sort of level of attack against them really went deep in the Israeli psyche, and I get all of that. But actually, 57 years of occupying the West Bank, of limiting movement, limiting income, limiting opportunities, of taking land, of destroying houses, and you look at the figures, you see it in Gaza now, 1,200 Israelis killed on October the 7th, 37,000 Palestinians killed since. Yes, there's been some Israeli fatalities as well during that time, but the difference is, and so it's a sense of actually what we're trying to do is trying to somehow redress the oppression and the injustice, but it's not because we hate Israel or anything like that,
It is a very, very difficult thing, really, and very concerning, because when you hear the Hamas saying that we will do it again and again and again and again, that means, to me, that means there's no chance to end this conflict. Anyway, it's a difficult one.
It is a difficult one, and our support of Palestinian people is our support of Palestinian people. It's not a support of the government or the leaders that are, involved in political ways. That money that we are sending is going to local grassroots organizations that we know who work for the good of human beings and humanity. Yes, Hamas will say, we'll do it again and again and again. And for me, this is why actually we need to one, get a ceasefire and then a peace process. Because actually, if we let Israel decide when this conflict finishes, this one, you're absolutely right. Month, 6 months, a year, whenever, we'll get something else. Because we've seen it. We've seen it. And violence and coercing people does not work. And so, for me, we've got to say that we bring a process whereby we can start to actually negotiate a way forward. Not using guns, not using bombs, not taking hostages, not firing rockets. There's Isaiah 11, a great picture of God's kingdom. You know, the wolf shall lie down with the lamb. Now, a friend of mine says to me that, you know what that means, David? It means that the wolf becomes a vegetarian, which I think is a wonderful way of seeing that. In other words, the wolf that has the power, the wolf that is the aggressor, the wolf that needs to feed off the other, actually has to give all of that up. But I retort to my friend by saying, but also the lamb needs to trust. Because if the lamb doesn't trust that the wolf has become a vegetarian, then the lamb won't go anywhere near it. So actually what we need is, one, for the aggressors to give up their aggression and their violence, for the ones that are oppressed to actually trust that that has happened. And that's when I believe you start getting justice. But the more bombs that you send to Gaza, the more that the lamb is not going to trust. Yeah? And so actually, that's what I think needs to happen in terms of the international community. That's why we need to get them away from this idea that we can keep arming and keep supporting the violence. And it doesn't matter whether we say this person did this, that person did that. Actually, let's give up that aggression and that power. Let's have some trust on the other side, and let's bring them together so we get that picture where the lion and the lamb lie down together, and that's peace. Yeah.
We are thinking about peace between the Palestinians and Israel. To what extent do you think we are going to have peace there if the conflict, or the cause of the conflict, is way beyond the scope of the Palestinians and Israel? Yeah. When you have the Middle Eastern conflicts, you have the Western conflicts, they are fighting.
I think that's, it's a really good question. And we've always had in the world, we've had those places where there is uneasy peace, where, we've seen it a little bit with Russia, Ukraine, and we've had that uneasy peace where Ukraine has been on the edge of that, and we've had NATO and Russia sort of just for a long time, that was okay, and then for whatever reason, Putin starts to try and take back some of what he reckons he's taking back. But what I'm trying to say is that I do think we can, even though there is a difference, between what we might call the West and we might call the Arab countries, and there is distrust and there are differences in opinion on lots of things. But I have to believe that we can produce a place where actually, even if it's uneasy, but there is some kind of peace there. And I think that process needs to be actually to bring to ensure that's why I think it needs to be an international process, because you need to ensure that there are representatives from the whole international community as well, so that sort of issue can be talked about, as well as the immediate sort of issue about how we reconcile Israel and Palestine living in that part of the land. And I think if you get a wider, going back to that when I showed you the UN partition, and the Arab states said, no, we don't agree with it, and Palestine said, no, we don't agree with it. And what happens? We get a war. And, you know, so that's why there needs to be that wider, and perhaps a recognition that we are talking about different worldviews, we are talking about different cultures, but actually, for the sake of the Palestinian people, for the sake of the Israeli people, we need to find a way in which we can make that place peaceful and a peaceful border as well.
Thank you very much, David.
Yeah.
Let me, I'm very aware of your time. How long do you think we can go up to this 14 or 13 minutes? So we close so that it allows.
I mean, we've been here a while. I mean, you know, I will talk forever. So, you know, the more you ask me questions, the more I'll talk. But I do recognise some people have gone. So I think maybe we yeah.
In the catch up early of talk, yeah. I just feel this, you just told us that, you know, we have found a way to make Israel and Palestine get along, live on that line. But in the international community, and you will say UN, they have this two-state solution there already. But it's only, you know, time to time, you can't get this, can't push it forward. I think it's very difficult to put this one forward, especially by America. Even America didn't agree. You know, even they agreed the two-state solution, but you know, still can't put going forward. And only for me, I mean, that we have this kind of discussion. What is the form? I don't want to ask the international, you know, that we can't do anything about it. But the only I'm saying is, as a Methodist church people or Methodist church, what we could do to help the situation, or even that it's not too much, but what we could do for the both, for this.
Yeah, I'll try and answer that quickly, and then we'll draw it to a close. Yeah. Okay. So yeah. I mean, firstly, in terms of a peace solution, how I would say is get Israel, Palestine together, get international community and good mediators, and actually say to Israel and Palestine, right, how do we sort this out? Because I think there's a danger of saying two-state, one-state, whatever. I think there needs to be real good conversation. I think out of that you could grow something that might be an effective peace deal. In terms of the Methodist Church, what can we do? You know, and I think that's, you know, it's so hard sometimes, isn't it? What can we do about lots of things? But I think as a Methodist Church, we need to continue to pray for the situation and for those people. Pray for the human beings, the families of hostages, the hostages themselves, the families of IDF soldiers that are fighting in Gaza. Pray for the Palestinians. Pray for, you know, those people that have lost family, their homes, those who are injured. We have to keep praying, but let's also pray for a peace and pray for a solution. I have lived through in my time seeing what we thought were intractable problems actually finding some kind of solution. So, you know, I have seen the end of apartheid in South Africa. I've seen the Berlin Wall come down. I've seen the end of what we used to call the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Now, don't get me wrong, there are still issues in those countries, but we have seen what appeared intractable actually moving forward. So let's pray for that. I think also as a Methodist Church, as I've hinted, I think we need to do some theological work on our understanding of the Promised Land. I think we need to be bold enough to criticize the Israeli policy and government as we do with Hamas and their decisions, and we should also just try and encourage our politicians to actually seek peace there and to actually be involved in enabling that to happen. And I think we can do that at all levels, and all of us can pray. Perhaps we can't all influence our politicians, but as a Methodist Church, we might be able to try and exert our influence. Thank you. Thank you.
And I've asked Reverend to close this talk with a short prayer, please.
And one of my favourite theological quotes is from a group of Colombian women who were fighting for liberation of their people. And their quote that I've used in many an essay is, "Not a war to destroy us, nor a peace that oppresses us." Let's hold a moment of quiet as we offer to God all that we have thought, all that we have heard, all that is going on in our world and specifically in that region today. God of life, God of hope, God of love, it pains us to see such conflict in your world. It pains us to see so many in despair. And we cry out, how long, O Lord, will this continue? How long will your creation struggle? We pray for Israel. We pray for Gaza. We pray for the West Bank. We pray for all those living in those regions, and specifically for the innocent caught up in this conflict. For those we have heard about earlier who are struggling with anxiety, with depression, with trauma. For those who have been displaced from their homes. We pray for those in these regions that hold power and influence, that you might soften hearts, bring people round a wide and long table where relationships can build, community can form, and peace can begin. We ask, O Lord, for a miracle in this situation. Have your hands over these people. And loving God, show us, how can we be a church that responds to the need of that region? And a church that encourages our leaders and power structures to do the same. So guide us as you bless the people of that region. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Lord. Thank you. Yes, this is the end of our talk. Very